Back to breaking news. President Donald Trump has confirmed that conservative activist Charlie Kirk has died following a shooting at the Utah Valley University campus. This is a live look of that campus right now. Kirk is an ally of President Donald Trump, and he was visiting the campus as part of his tour for Turning Point USA, a conservative youth organization founded by Kirk. Now, this is video of him speaking at a previous event. The university is saying Kirk was speaking to students at the time when shots were fired from a campus building about 200 yards away. We're seeing reaction from across the political spectrum and, of course, others who have followed Charlie Kirk very closely throughout his career as a public speaker and conservative activist. We'll continue to hear more reaction tonight and get more updates about a potential suspect in custody and more on what took place earlier this afternoon. Again, President Trump reporting and confirming that Charlie Kirk has died at a shooting at the Utah Valley University campus.